The dentists who are graduating now will be far better dentists than you and I. They have access to information that was unheard of for you and I.
Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Savvy Dentist podcast, the show where great dentistry meets great business. In today's episode, we're having a conversation with Dr. Lincoln Harris. Lincoln is really well known, not just in Australia, but around the world as an educator of dentists. Since graduation, he's been completely focused on excellence and quality in all its forms. And from the very beginning of his dentistry, he's been on a quest to really hone his skills, hone his abilities. And that shows now as he teaches and trains other dentists the skills and qualities that he's been able to acquire over his career. Since graduation, he's particularly trained in aesthetic implant techniques, full mouth rehab, to name just a few things, and he's immensely skillful and knowledgeable in these areas. These days, Lincoln not only manages to run a successful practice in his hometown of Bargara in Queensland, he lectures all around the world throughout Australia, North America, Asia, Singapore, United Kingdom, and other countries in Europe as well. In today's conversation, we covered quite a bit of territory. Lincoln is a very laconic guy. He's really funny, which I've been looking forward to this interview for quite a while. And we go through a lot around Lincoln's background, some of the hiccups he's had along the way in his own career, but more importantly, the lessons he's learned, and he shares the key insights around that for our audience as well. We cover things around some of the common challenges dentists face in practice, what guides decision-making processes, and of course, how he's come to build restoring excellence into the behemoth that it now is. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. And without any further ado, here's Dr. Lincoln Harris. Lincoln Harris, welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day all the way from Bargara in Queensland. How are you going, mate?
Coming all the way from Bargara over Skype is not a particularly onerous task, so I appreciate you thanking me for it, but Skype sort of negates the effort required to come all the way from Bargara.
Yeah, I know. And when you're in Bargara, you don't want to leave Bargara because it is, picture perfect postcard kind of country. So, half your luck, mate. That sounds fantastic.
It's certainly quite pleasant at the moment. There is a period of the time where it can get a little bit hot and humid, and well, it's not that bad. I mean, we really only turn the air conditioning on probably once in the summer, December, and then we turn it off in March. So as long as you do that, you're generally okay.
Well, we had a balmy 6 degrees this morning as I was taking the kids to school, and I thought of you. I thought, must be really tough up there in Queensland at the moment. So I'm a little envious at the moment, but that's okay. It's okay.
Well, as long as you keep your thoughts about me to the weather, I'm quite comfortable. But,
yeah. Cool. We're good.
So, you're in Canberra.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, 6 is quite warm.
Exactly. It's almost summer. Now, mate, firstly, thanks for coming onto the show. I'm very pleased to have you on the show at last. It's been something that's been in the pipeline, or certainly been in my mind for a long time, to have you on the show, because you're really well known, not just in Australia, but globally, as an educator of dentists, and you've got this reputation for excellence in clinical care. What I really wanted to just start today's conversation with, Lincoln, was really just trying to understand a little bit about your journey, your backstory, how you got to the point of where you are. I understand you opened your practice in about 2000, but what's your dental journey been like to get you to this point?
Well, if you were a psychologist, you'd probably have to go back to, my earliest sort of memories, and that's going to get very deep and meaningful, and we don't have that much time. So people's personalities get formed very early, and so some of what we are and what we do comes from our personality. Now, that's very important because you can't actually be someone else no matter how much you try. And so when you're educating or when you're learning, that's something to keep in mind. You can't make someone be someone other than they are, and you can't become someone else. So when you're learning, you can't be the lecturer. You can't be your mentor, and you can't be whoever inspires you. You have to take what you can from them, but then be yourself. So as far as why am I like I am, I have no idea. It would go back to all sorts of formative things. I do know that when I was at dental school, I remember I had this one tutor came in. He was a general dentist, and he said, we were doing something, I forget what. It was probably using, it was probably like taking an impression with thin cord and thick retraction cord, which just about everyone in the world gets taught to do, and then immediately they graduate and they disband it. And then they go to a course in Crown and Bridge work 5 years later about how to take perfect impressions, and they get taught to use thin and thick cord, and they go, wow, this is a revelation. It's amazing. This is new stuff. It's incredible. Next minute, they'll be talking about that rubber sheet stuff. This dentist came in and he said, well, it's all fine doing this at dental school, but you can't do this in the real world. Like people won't pay for you to do this quality of work. And it kind of just sparked something in me that already at dental school, I think it was 4th or 5th year, our tutors were telling us, look, as soon as you graduate, you're going to have to lower your quality and bring it down to the market. And so I just thought, well, maybe that's true, but I'm going to try and have a private practice where, I do the best I can. Now, the best I can it's a relative thing and it changes over time. The stuff when I first graduated, I thought I was pretty hot. Dentally, not physically.
Oh, come on, mate. I've seen photos. You're all right, mate. You're doing okay.
Okay, now you're getting me uncomfortable. I mean, first the weather, now this.
I know, it's getting really creepy, isn't it? The creepiness factor's just hit through the 10 mark, so we're good now. It's all normal again.
It's gone, Jesse. So that kind of has been my approach, is that do the best I can. Now, obviously, the best I could when I first graduated was pretty crap. But, doing over time, if you aim for something, that's half the journey. Now, the reason I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think that it's important because dentists are not really trained. So we are not really competent when we graduate. Okay, what we do is every bit as hard as ophthalmology, but an ophthalmologist gets almost 3 times as much training as we do, and a lot of it is massive surgical repetition. So they actually do a lot of clinical work before they said, here's your degree, you're free to go and work in private practice. So we basically get thrown out. Basically, it's like we can almost walk, and then they say, okay, go out and be a tightrope artist. All of our learning then, or our competence, comes after we graduate. Well, most of our competence comes after we graduate. So we get thrown out, go and become competent. And so at that point, you have many different paths you can take. So you can become quite competent and follow sort of a path of self-discipline. Unfortunately, in dentistry, you don't actually get financially rewarded, particularly in your first years, for trying to increase your competence. So basically, when you first graduate, the faster you do treatment and you ditch that double cord technique straight away, because if you do 2 cords, you get paid less. That's the reality. Well, back to how did I get here? I don't know. I started practice in 2000. I wanted to do the best I could. I think I was one of the higher cost dentists in the area the day I opened, and I thought I knew everything for probably about 6 years, and then I started going to so I didn't go to many courses for a few years, and then maybe 6 years after I started the practice, I started doing courses, and all of a sudden I realised that the value for me was not in going to lectures where you had 17 speakers speak for 30 minutes each. It was in going to, big hands-on courses. So I started a rule for myself back then, which was if it was less than 2 days or less than $2,000, it probably wasn't worth going to. And so I only went to, intensive things for quite a long time. Now going to lectures is worthwhile because I've kind of got the actual background skills to use the knowledge. But prior to that, if I went and saw a lecture on implants and they showed some fancy technique, I wouldn't have had the surgical skill to use the technique with any success.
So what I'm hearing then, Lincoln, is you spend a lot of time really nailing down some fundamentals and, surgical skills, being able to, raise a flap, suture, remove bone safely, adequately, and all the rest of it. All those fundamental skills is where you started that focus. Is that correct?
No, I actually hated surgery and I hated extractions when I first graduated. So
how ironic.
I mostly did restorative stuff.
But still with a focus on fundamentals?
Restorative is where we're most comfortable when we graduate. We tend to have spent more time training on how to do fillings and crowns than probably any other procedure. And so my first stuff was like on rehab, pros, how to plan full arch stuff, full arch pros things, occlusion, and all of those types of things. Now, you have to appreciate how many mistakes I've made. So to progress carefully is more slow and more steady than if you progress quickly. But if you progress quickly, then you make more mistakes. So I certainly have, at the time I thought it was amazing, and then when I look back, I go, my, what a lot of major errors I've made along the way. So I make a lot less now, I think, but maybe in 5 years I won't think that. We'll see.
Yeah, well, I think but that's part of everyone's learning, I think, Lincoln, is I remember, very similarly coming out of dental school thinking that, I had quite a few of these dental things, nailed down pretty well. And then, I was in the Navy and, like our good mate Pat Caldwell, who we both know, and I remember thinking that my treatment was fabulous until either I posted out of the place or they posted out of the place, and I'd catch up a few years later and see this work that at the time I thought was fantastic to, come across it later failing, and it was quite sobering and go, maybe I need to rethink some things here. And like you, I had to go on a bit of a journey of discovery and investing in myself and so on. But what I'm really curious to ask you as well, Lincoln, because again, you're so prolific in your work and the teaching that you do, is what do you see some of the biggest mistakes dentists make when they graduate? Obviously you see lots of dentists come through your courses. What are some of the common pitfalls?
I'm not going to say they're mistakes. They're just different paths. Okay. And I appreciate that. See, I philosophically think that patients have a significant responsibility for their health care as well as the practitioner. Now, that's not particularly trendy in some circles, including the regulators. As far as the regulator goes, the patient is basically a mindless drone and they can do the most stupid things ever. And it's basically it's actually like we're encouraged to be completely paternalistic as far as APRA is concerned. So now where I'm going with this is that, if a patient goes to 27 dentists to get the absolute cheapest bone graft and implant thing done, then I think they have responsibility in it. And it may be that the cheapest guy just happens to be amazing, but there's very few things in life where if you do it for a much lower price, there isn't, unless you can industrially manufacture it, there's generally a reduction in either safety margin, materials, quality. There's a reduction in something, okay? There's something has to give. You just can't, it's almost, like conservation of matter. You can't just make something out of nothing unless it's a jolly nuclear explosion. So dentists, you need different sorts of dentists because you actually need dentists who do fairly low quality work because there's a whole bunch of patients who like that sort of thing. They that's their thing and that's what they want, just like TVs and fridges and anything else. The mistakes I see from a clinical point of view, if you focus on earning a lot and then immediately saddle yourself with high lifestyle expenses, then you are trapped on the path that you're on. So that's probably the biggest thing I see. People trap themselves. Dentists earn a lot and you can very quickly get trapped by your income. So if just say you graduate and you work in a clinic and the clinic encourages you to do things that you don't really sit well with you, but you think to yourself, well, I'm just going to do this for a few years, make some money, and then I'm going to turn myself around. Okay. And then next thing you've got an expensive car and you've got an expensive house and you've got an expensive spouse. You've got all these, your personal overhead becomes very high. So it's not your business overhead, but your personal overhead is very high, and then you've got to feed it. And then, so you can't take any risk then. You can't go, well, if I start doing a bit better stuff and charging a bit more or offering people these more complete treatment plans or whatever it is, then you feel it under pressure because you think, well, if they say no to the treatment plan if I offer them full periodontal treatment, which is what I should do, but then they might say no because the guy down the road just does a scale for $120 on everyone and doesn't go below the gums because it's dangerous down there. Then you start feeling under pressure because you go, well, if they reject my treatment plan, I can't pay the mortgage. And so they get saddled. That's probably the biggest one, is people get trapped by their income. The second biggest one is thinking you know a lot. That's just part of learning, and we all go through that cycle of thinking we know everything because learning is very much a grieving process. So you when someone says, actually, here's some more information, for you to accept that information, you have to first believe that you need to know it. So if you think you know everything, then you can't accept it. So to accept new information, you have to realise that you don't know everything. So going from thinking you know everything to not knowing everything is a shock. It can be. And so it's kind of like you go through denial, anger, so whatever it is, denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance, or whatever. You'll see that in a lecture. If you give a lecture and you say something a little bit controversial that the people haven't heard before, what's the first thing they go, well, that's not true. That's rubbish. I've always been told this. See, so there's denial. And then you go, and then they'll go, well, that's ridiculous. Okay, there's anger. And then you go, oh, everything I've done up till now is terrible. Okay, there's depression. And then, well, maybe that's okay, but this new theory might be, maybe they're both true. That's bargaining, and then acceptance. Now, the progress that you go through that depends on the person. So some people, if you want to see when someone introduces a new procedure, you'll see this process happen straight away. It's the first thing that everyone says about a new procedure is it's rubbish and it doesn't work.
It's interesting. I think I've seen that whole cycle in one Facebook thread. To be honest with you,
you can see like everyone at different stages on the same thread.
It's absolutely completely true. All you got to do is look in some of the different posts here and there, and you'll see that whole range of emotions. So, given that there's some challenges when people graduate, thinking that they might know it all, or being trapped by a lifestyle, expensive house. What do you see as the counter to that? What sort of advice, if you were talking or mentoring a recent graduate today, what sort of advice would you be giving them, particularly around those areas? Given there's not a one-size-fits-all, I get all that, but
there's not a one-size-fits-all. And look, how responsive would you have been to all sorts of advice when you were just graduated?
Well, for me personally, probably not.
Yeah, neither would I have. So neither you nor I would have listened to anyone. We knew everything. So most people who graduate are probably the same. So for the one person out there who is not feeling like that when they graduate, here's some advice.
So N equals 1.
Okay. Don't buy a massive house.
Don't buy a flash car. But all jokes aside, for that one person, apart from the don't get trapped in the financial cycle, beyond the, do the opposite of the bad things we spoke about earlier, if someone said to me, look, Lincoln, look, Lincoln, I'm at the start of my career. I'm really open to suggestion. Can you just give me a couple of key pointers? Where should I, put my energy? Do you have any thoughts around that in particular? Even from a clinical point of view, where would you start the process?
Okay, the first thing is that you want to decide where you want to go. So where do you want to end up? What type of person are you? Are you just a business person who wants to have practices? Okay, in which case I wouldn't suggest necessarily that you go and learn massive amounts of high-level surgical techniques or that type of thing. Are you a person who wants to only do one procedure but doesn't want to specialise? Do you want to So you've got to decide that type of thing first, because what happens, it's a bit like treatment planning or anything else in life. If you just sort of float down a path for 10 years and then you don't really like it and you never really wanted to go that way anyway, it's kind of a shame. So decide where you want to go first. Now, if you actually like the clinical side of dentistry and you want to excel in that area, basically my advice is don't do what I did. So don't wait 6 years before you start doing decent courses. Now, I hear people all the time go, now you're too young to be doing these type of courses. I think that's not true. I wish that I had done more education. Like, to give you an example, I didn't start learning implant surgery when I had surgical skills, okay, because I hated extractions. I had extractions because I was bad at surgical extractions. I hated doing wisdom teeth. I stopped doing them because I was bad at them. Now, I do third molars now, and I do third molars now because I do wisdom teeth. Because I do implants. So when I started doing implants, what's the first thing you have to do an implant and an extraction? So I had to learn to both do extractions and to like them. So prior to that, I'd always been too posh for extractions. I was a fancy restorative dentist, and extractions were like for poor people and low quality dentists. And so I was fairly up myself at the time. I had to learn that an extraction is a vital and necessary part of dentistry. And you still see that attitude now. You'll see people who go, they go crazy online. You extract a tooth and it's like you've done a massacre of, it's just the emotion that comes out of dentists about extracting a teeth is emotional, and unreasonable often. So I learned to do implants. From implant surgery come the how to do extractions, and from that type of surgery, procedures overlap. So if you learn implant surgery, it makes you a better surgical extraction dentist, because doing incisions, the skill of doing an incision is the same whether it's for an extraction or a soft tissue graft or whatever. The sutures, if you learn to do third molars, then you know how to suture, and that suturing skill then goes into doing implants where the suturing skill is much higher, and then that to soft tissue grafting, which the suturing skill is much higher. So all of that skill overlaps. It's not like if you learn to do soft tissue grafts, it's completely distinct from other things. So anyway, the point of that is I wish I'd done more intense courses earlier on and seen the value in them. Now, obviously, I have to make the disclaimer that obviously because I have a relatively large business training people, I've got a conflict of interest when I say that, but that is my personal thing. I wish I hadn't spent 6 years after I started my practice and 7 or 8 years after I graduated not learning any intense, like not going to anything that was intense, nothing hands-on, nothing where you actually learn significant improvements that you would take back to your practice.
Okay, so there's a fair bit in that. And given that you wish you'd learnt that earlier, and given that since I graduated back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, things have changed dramatically in dentistry. I remember we were still doing loads of amalgam and all that sort of stuff when I graduated, and the old half hollowback got a bit of a workout. Times have moved on a lot since then, and even at the recent Congress, I saw some video reviews of the different pieces of technology coming out. Whether it's 3D printing and further development of the CAD/CAM methodology. Where do you see the trends coming down the pipeline? I guess I'm just trying to crystal ball a little bit here. Where do you see dentistry going in the future with respect to treatment planning, delivery of treatment, and even some of the science behind it?
Interestingly, there's some parts of dentistry that haven't actually improved that much for a long time. There are some parts of dentistry where our technology has sort of decreased it, not increased. But anyway, we'll put that to the side. The dentists who are graduating now will be far better dentists than you and I. They have access to information that was unheard of for you and I. So the big trend I see is that the age at which people master advanced skills is going to get lower and lower and lower. When I graduated, I had never seen nor heard of a soft tissue graft in my entire I graduated in 98. So in all that time, for 5 years, I hadn't heard nor seen it. I'd heard of they glossed over in half a lecture bone grafting furcations, but it was kind of poo-pooed as a silly idea that would never catch on and was unreliable and so on. And so that's my first prediction is, you will soon see dentists who are 2 or 3 years out who will be doing soft tissue grafts. They'll be doing things that would once have been advanced specialist skills. Now, their brains will actually be wired differently, and we know this is true because my brother he used to work for Cisco in sort of installing large networks and things across Asia Pacific, and they spend a lot of time researching, all sorts of stuff to do with people. And people who grow up today don't see the internet as a technology the way you and I do. So you and I don't think of the refrigerator as some amazing thing. It's just a thing that should work because it's always been there. Whereas our grandparents will remember the first refrigerators and how amazing it was to have meat that lasted more than 2 days. So people, you and I sort of migrated to the internet, whereas people graduating today, they've always had the internet. Their brain is actually, the neural pathways are slightly different and actually set up more for having all the world's information at their fingertips. So because dentists now grow up in full immersion, they see these incredibly complex, detailed, multidisciplinary procedures that you and I would never have seen except for maybe in a couple of pros lectures. They see them day in, day out, and that has to have an effect on you. Like you're seeing this sort of thing again and again and again. It must affect their knowledge base, their way they see complex dentistry. So that will have a huge effect of its own, just being immersed in all the world's knowledge sort of all the time. I think printing is obviously, I can't see the future very far ahead. I think printing is, what do economists say? Economists say, they usually use words like may and
possibly and should.
After their prediction doesn't come true, which is most of the time, then they go that the future was less clear than we thought. As if it's ever clear.
Yeah, I know. Just think back to 2007 around that for a moment. If only they'd had a bit more clarity. Just want to come back to the immersion of the new and recent graduates in really complicated cases. I remember going to a lecture when I was in 4th or 5th year dentistry, and it was on posterior resins. And this is 93, 94, around that time. And I remember the lecturer at the time getting up in front of the 5th or 4th years, whatever year I was in, saying, "Okay, here's the lecture on posterior resins. Don't do them." And that's not that long ago. And just to think that even that has changed so dramatically, let alone the multidisciplinary, complicated treatment that we're seeing, you see everywhere these days. All you've got to do is look at various forums like your own. We see, wonderful treatment, style Italiano, all these really cool things. But it's got to be, I think you're right, that these young guys graduating are getting exposed to this breadth of knowledge, depth of knowledge that certainly, I never knew was out there. Just didn't know. And I remember learning about guided tissue regeneration, again, theoretically as an undergrad, and never really kind of hearing anything about it again until years and years and years later. And it's phenomenal the way things are going.
That's because we had not Teflon, they had Gore-Tex membranes back then. And once they got exposed, didn't they go wrong? And we realised that Gore-Tex was only good for wearing skiing.
So if you have a stack on the mountain, just rip off a bit of your parka and shove it under your gingiva, you should be all right.
Gore-Tex, the idea, when you do a graft, you're always slightly on edge anyway. And the idea of using sort of a fabric.
I think they should have used Velcro myself. I think that would have been more successful. Just, have everything stick on.
Yeah, so actually I think we were taught that, I can't remember. It was a long time ago. I did get a lecture from Dr. Smythe on how posterior resins didn't work, and then we had a picture of amalgams. So this was before I realised that you could massively influence the way a discussion went, but the picture you showed. I still remember having a bite wing of an amalgams which were all pristine and a bite wing of composite resin which were all caries. And then I graduated into public health, and immediately I started seeing bite wings of amalgams with caries under them as well, and realised that didn't keep the carie man away.
Well, and I think that comes back to the initial acceptance of, or I can't remember the journey you went through before, acceptance and, ultimately getting to the point you go, well, composite resin can work just as well as anything, provided it's placed well.
I don't think composite resin works it doesn't last as long as amalgam. We've got no proof that it lasts 60 years in the mouth yet, because I've never seen one. So
no. And by the time there is proof for that, mate, I suspect our practicing days might be behind us.
Well, I think that, there are some trends you can't fight, and one of them is that people don't want black things on their teeth.
Yeah. There's a hot tip for N equals 1 out there. Black teeth, just don't do it. Hey, Lincoln, we've covered a fair bit of territory today, mate, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and hang with us. But what I'd really like to just capture as we wrap up, if we were going to think about your practice, and obviously it's massively successful up there in Bargara, what would be 2 or 3 guiding principles that have held you in good stead as you've built your practice? Just putting the clinical stuff aside for a moment, but just thinking a little more broadly about your practice. If there was some good decisions along the way, what is it you think you've done well that's led to the success you obviously enjoy? And I know you're very modest, but you do have a high degree of success there. So what would be a couple of key learnings for you?
To have a very clear vision. So I know that sounds like sort of, look, I don't go in for business management nonsense. I was at a big company recently that had one of those flow charts that has all their core principles and how they're going to engage with the customer. And it was so wordy and cold that I thought, boy, if this is how you engage with the customer, they'd be all asleep. So it's what I'd call jargon bingo for businesses. It's very simple. Just decide what type of dentist you are. The difficulty is that when you start a practice, you don't actually know who you are. You kind of have this idea, but it's not until later on that you really appreciate what types of things you like to do, what you're good at, and where you should focus your direction. So if you're entrepreneurial, the biggest problem you'll have is not seeing opportunities. It'll be that there's too many opportunities and you tend to bounce all over the place chasing them all. So work out what you're really good at and do that thing, and don't do all sorts of things that you're not good at. With my practice, I'm very stubborn. So stubbornness is very good if you're on a good track. Like if you decide to go in a direction and it's working, but you hit sort of some hard times or something, stubbornness is extremely important. But stubbornness is a bit of a drawback if you, like there are times when you just can be completely out of step with the market and you go, this is where I'm going to go, and there's just no customers for that service or that type of work. So in those situations, stubbornness is a bit of a thing. I just do what I enjoy, Jesse. Like, I don't.
Mate, I reckon that's really sound advice. I reckon that's really good advice.
Don't do stuff you don't like. I will tell you one thing I have noticed, and this is not going to be true for everyone, but it's true for a lot of dentists. Dentists like to do good work. There's a vast majority of dentists actually like to do good work. And if they are in an environment which does not allow them to do good work, they become unhappy about dentistry and they eventually dislike dentistry, and they basically do dentistry 4 to 5 days a week so that they can enjoy themselves on the weekend. There's a dentist who was very famous, not as famous now, but he was very famous for a long time, and most people completely missed his point, okay? And you would know who it is. It's Paddy Lund.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and Paddy Lund, everyone thought his books and stuff was about getting rid of your front desk and giving people a cup of tea. His point was, don't do dentistry in a way that you hate for the 2 days a week to enjoy yourself. So in his particular case, that meant not focusing on money and whatever and throughput and vast volumes and blah, blah, blah. You know, so that is something that I think is very important. If you do dentistry just for money, it will just be a job, and eventually you'll hate it. There has to be some art, there has to be some craft, there has to be some joy, whether it's satisfying patients. You have to get something out of it because you're going to do this for a long time. And if you absolutely cannot bring yourself to do that, then, you know, obviously go into business, own practices or something.
Yeah, look, I had the opportunity to read a book recently. It was a Richard Branson book, and one of the things he says very resoundingly, and that is, if it's not fun, don't do it. And I'd agree. Yeah, I'm also of the view, though, that there's a lot of people sitting under trees trying to find their passion and waiting for some epiphany that never comes. But I really think that there's got to be some enjoyment in everything that you do. Otherwise, life's too short. Life is there to be lived, and if you can get some joy from your clinical work, I think, and put yourself in an environment that supports that, then I think that makes the whole journey infinitely more enjoyable. And I think people grow better too. I think it's an upward spiral.
And a lot of your best business things won't be things that you planned. So I have the Restoring Excellence business now, and so we now, it's basically, it sounds silly to me, but it's basically a global teaching business now, and I really enjoy it. And it wasn't planned. It just kind of, I like to put photos of procedures on the internet, and I've always liked that from when I was in Dental Town, because you learn a lot. I don't know, probably strokes your ego a bit too, and it forces you to do better, and it gives you some reason to do your dentistry well, because the patient sometimes will never appreciate what you've done. And so just from that sort of accident of putting pictures on the internet, this business has popped up where I teach people, and I actually really enjoy teaching. So, standing up and speaking and trying to help people and trying to push them past what they thought were their limits without kind of making them cry too often. Dentistry is about fear, Jesse. Like, so much of dentistry is a fear-based thing, and so a lot of my teaching is about, people are constrained by their fear. So part of my job is to push them right up to where they're afraid, and then go, right, let's go past that. And so that's what a lot of teaching is about. So
I think that's absolutely true. I remember very, very clearly going into university dental clinics, almost without exception, in 5th year, clinic 7 and 8, up in the Queensland Uni Dental School, just bricking it almost every time I went in, and I hated that experience. And it took me a long time to get past that, actually.
It was at least 5 years after I started my practice before I could go to work and not feel anxious.
Yeah, completely.
Probably 10 years after I started my practice that I could waltz into work never having thought about what I was going to do that day. So there's my hot tip for people who are studying dentistry or who are finding dentistry hard. So my tip of the day is that dentistry is actually really difficult.
And it's normal to feel that way, right?
Yeah, and people who go into dentistry don't appreciate that it's really difficult, and often you get a bit of an idea, and when you start doing clinical, you go, wow, this is hard. How do you do a crown prep on a 2.7 with a mirror full of water? Whatever, Jeannie. Said if people are finding it hard, it's because it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, mate, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I really do thank you. And all the listeners at Savvy Dentist will know who you are, and I'm sure that this episode's going to be one that people come back to over and over again because there's so many, valuable hints and tips and pearls of wisdom that you've shared. So, Lincoln, on behalf of all of us here at Savvy Dentist, thanks, mate. I really genuinely appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and hang with us.
Okay, thanks for the call, Jesse. It was great fun.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessiegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessiegreen.com and download the free report.